Hey there, welcome back to another video. This time around, it is my review of the 2015 Italian fairy tale film, Tale of Tales. Now, before I get around to sharing more of my thoughts on this film, I would like to give a special shout out to David for requesting this review. And if there's another film, TV show, or topic that you would like to see me discuss in the future, feel free to donate to either my PayPal or to my Patreon. The link to both is in the video description down below, and I will try to get your request as soon as I possibly can. Now, A Tale of Tales is one of those films that, in all honesty, it's just not my cup of tea. I don't think it's a bad film, but I don't think it's really that great of a film either. It's one of those movies that, due to the limitations of the source material, it's really put in between a rock and a hard place. It's directed by a man named Matteo Garrone, and this is his first and his last English language film that he directed. And I could kind of see why. There are definitely some moments with some of the American or Hollywood actors that were cast for this where I think there was some loss in translation going on in terms of how the director was able to get through to them. So it leads to some pretty awkward line delivery at points. Also, I think there were some moments where maybe the vision of the director didn't necessarily match with what the cinematographer was trying to do. So that it definitely does seem like there was a lot of moments where the fact that he was Italian and English wasn't really his first language and wasn't really able to like communicate a lot of things of what he might have wanted to do uh, properly with the rest of his crew. I think that definitely did come into play here, and maybe he might have had not necessarily the best experience with these actors or with the production as a result, and so that's why he never decided to ever do it again. There is an Italian version of this, though. In fact, that was the first version that I initially tried to watch, but I couldn't really get into it because of the fact that I just didn't feel the dub was that good. So I wound up tracking down the English version instead. And it was definitely a more easy watch than the Italian dub, but it still wasn't what I would consider to be honestly that satisfying of a film or an experience. The direction by Garrone, though, it's not what I would consider to be great, but it works. It's pretty efficient. It's pretty effective. I think there are some moments where maybe things weren't necessarily translated properly in terms of what his desires were for his direction. So there are some inconsistencies sometimes visually, but there are a lot of other moments though where the visuals are actually pretty solid, and I think he does a good job directing a given scene, especially scenes that he can take advantage of some lush and lavish production design or a particular setting like the woods. I think that's definitely something where his direction shines. Also, when it comes to sequences that might be trying to build some tension, I think he does a pretty good job with those as well. Or scenes that are trying to showcase, surprisingly enough, practical effects. I think those scenes are shot well, and I think are definitely some of the biggest highlights of the film directing wise. There's some there's some all right bits of variety when it comes to his camera work and his technique. Like it's not completely stoic, stodgy film when it comes to its direction. It does have a decent and fair amount of movement to it when it comes to certain scenes. The camera definitely does pan and zoom, and there's some traveling shots here and there. There's some wide shots that are pretty technically skilled, but there are some scenes where some shots can look a bit stuffy. But overall, I think that it's at least an above average job by the director. It's not great. It's not fantastic. I've definitely seen more visionary, more visually stimulating, and fun and inventive direction by other directors from Italy or in other parts of the world. But it's still not what I would consider to be that disappointing when it comes to the direction. Now, the script is where things are honestly at their weakest. It's written by Edoardo Albanati, Ugo Citti, Matteo Garrone, and Massimo Guardioso. And it's based upon these stories from this book of poems called the Pentamerone by Giambattista Basile or Basile. And it's it's definitely a product of its time. And this is what I'm talking about when it comes to the limitations of the source material. So it deals with three stories: the enchanted doe, the flayed old lady, and the flea. And the director, he's talking about how he picked the stories because he wants them to connect with contemporary themes, plastic surgery, the frenzied desire to have a child, the conflict between generations, the painful passage from adolescence to adulthood. He picked all three of these stories because they have distinct themes, but all this contemporary stuff that he's mentioning doesn't really translate. And these stories just feel like of their time. And I think that really makes it hard to get that into them. And it exposes some of the clunky storytelling elements of these poems and of these stories, because there really wasn't much work done by the writers to change anything. They pretty much just stuck with what was on the page for the most part. So they didn't really add their personal touch to it. They didn't add a contemporary touch to it. So what you get is an adaptation that's, for the most part, well shot, has a budget behind it, of these really old poems. And I've always felt that even something like Grimm's fairy tales, or even some of the older fairy tales that were published throughout history, I've always felt that they don't necessarily adapt that well without a lot of tweaks that are done to them to make them more compelling and interesting for contemporary audiences. And this is a prime example of that. It also doesn't help that the chosen formula and the format for the anthology is really wonky. The director, for some reason, decided he's going to do a very off kilter approach to the anthology format. So it starts out with one story that doesn't really conclude. It gets halfway through or just starts. Then it starts a second story. Then that one isn't really complete, but then you'll go back to the first story. Then you'll go back to the second story, or you'll start the third story, or you'll do. It's just a really janky way to tell these stories. So it really affects how you're able to become invested in these stories, because if you do get interested in any one of these stories, there's a certain point where then it's just going to stop telling that story and then they're going to go to something else. It'd be like if somebody is reading you some of these poems and they start reading the first poem, then for whatever reason they stop reading, and then start reading the second poem, and then they stop reading that, and then they start reading the third poem, or they read the third poem and then go back to the second poem. It's something that would be incredibly frustrating if you were somebody listening to somebody reading these poems off to you. So I don't understand why the director felt that that was a wise choice, or the writers felt that this is a wise choice in terms of framing these stories. And like I said, a lot of these stories are limited in terms of what they can do with a lot of things, a lot of key elements. Can't really have a lot of extra character depth because it's not in the story. You can't have a lot of different sort of takes on some of these things, like making the flea more of a part of the story than it actually is, because it's not a part of the story. The flea is in the story, but it's not the main focal point. So you can't really go outside the box in that way. So you're very rigid in terms of your storytelling and what you can do. And as a result, all three of these stories never really become anything that's really that satisfying, uh, and really that strong. Like the first story is The Enchanted Doe, and it deals with this king and queen, and the queen cannot conceive a child. So then a necromancer suggests that if the queen eats a sea dragon's heart cooked by a virgin, she will get pregnant. But this will wind up costing a life. The king kills a sea dragon, but he dies. The queen eats the heart the next day after a virgin cooked the heart, and the virgin becomes pregnant, but so does the queen. Then the story kind of stops there, and then it goes into the second story when it comes to the structure of the film. But it flashes forward like 16 years later. The queen's son Elias has grown up, and he's albino, and he's got the strange appearance, probably due to the nature of his birth. Uh, and he has a brother who is the boy that was born at the same time as the queen's son, who was born from the virgin. And so he's got a brother who's an identical twin, and the queen doesn't want Elias to see this brother anymore, so she tries to separate the two from one another, and she tries to kill one of the other brother, who's not Elias. She tries to kill, I think Joseph is his name. She tries to kill him. He escapes. He decides to leave the kingdom. And before he leaves, though, he leaves some kind of brook behind that his brother can look at to tell him whether or not he is in danger or not. If the brook is clean, he's fine. If the brook gets muddied, he's in trouble. If the brook dries up entirely, then he's dead. So the brook gets muddied, and so then Elias goes to search for his brother. His brother's being attacked by this creature. And then Elias winds up killing this creature and saving his brother, and returns his brother to the kingdom. And apparently the creature was his mother, the queen. That wasn't executed that well, if you ask me, because you saw the whole kill the monster, turns into a female, but because of the camera work and because of maybe the way it was written, it's too vague. It's like a side profile, so you can't really tell that it's Salma Hayek right away. So I didn't even know it was Salma Hayek's character, the Queen, until I looked it up, and I read that that's how that poem and how that story ends. So that wasn't really that well executed because of how clunky the final shot was. I would say, though, that that's the most interesting story out of the two. I guess the one that has the best execution overall. Maybe not the most interesting, because the Flea one, to be honest, was the most interesting to me, but the execution wasn't the best. So it's a matter of, this one had the better execution, and it still had enough intrigue to kind of keep me invested in it. But at the end of the day, I still thought it was rather forgettable and kind of dull, because of the fact that there were just certain limitations it could not work around, or didn't choose to work around, because it decided to be so faithful to the source material. The second story is The Flayed Old Lady. This is the weakest one out of all of them. It's some king of some other kingdom, which, by the way, none of these other kings are ever explained, so that you can get lost and you're like, wait, what kingdom is this king a part of? I thought there was that one king who died fighting the sea monster. Why is there another king? Is it, I guess this is a completely different kingdom. I don't know what kingdom it is, because it's never really discussed or clarified in the movie. It's clarified in the stories, in the poems apparently, but not in the movie for whatever reason. So it just keeps jumping back and forth, and you're thinking that this is all happening as a part of the same kingdom. And there's just these different kings for whatever reason. But it's not. It's a completely different kingdom for each of these stories. So the king of Strongcliff, he hears this woman singing. He decides to court her outside her home, but she doesn't want to necessarily commit to it because she's an old woman who lives with her sister who's also elderly. And so this woman decides, despite the risk, to continue to string along this king. So you have Emma and Dora. And so Dora's the one that decides to string along this king, tell him, oh, I can't let you see me tonight, but if you come back in a week, I'll let you see my finger. She shows a finger, but it's actually her sister's finger because she tries burning her finger to try to, make it younger, I guess. And all it does is just give her a burnt finger. And so the king, he's super horny, really wants to get to Dora, really wants to bang her, and she's like, okay, you can bang me. Of course, that's not actually what is said, but like, you can make love to me if you turn the lights off and there's no candlelight and it's in complete darkness. And he agrees to it, but because he's the kind of guy that he is, he wants to sneak a peek late one night, and he sees that it's an old woman. Then it has her thrown out of the balcony to what he thinks is her demise, but she somehow survives. And then she gets, I guess, she gets rescued basically by this witch who lives in the woods, who gives her some tit milk, and then she becomes young. That not explained, but that's how it was in the story. Similar to how the two brothers can breathe underwater and have magic abilities, like creating a magic spring that can predict events that are tied into their bloodline. None of that's explained either. This is what I'm talking about when it comes to things that can make these stories more compelling, provide more depth, actually give the audience more information about these characters, or more backstory, or if not, if you don't want to do more backstory, then at least explain some of these things better, because it just comes across as randomness. You're like, okay, it's just magic tit milk, I guess, makes you young. You don't know what the rules are in terms of how she stays young, or any of that. She decides to go to bed with the king, the king that decides to make Dora his queen. She initially invites her older sister to the ceremony. Like, it's not really the wedding ceremony, but it's essentially like the coronation ceremony. And the sister, she doesn't want to leave her sister Dora. Dora's like, you're embarrassing me. You got to get out of here. I can't nobody can know about us being sisters. You've but I want to stay with you. It's like, you can't do that. Why would they buy that you're my sister? You're old. And then she's like, what, can I be young like you? It's like, no. I was like, how can I be young? How did you become young? And then the sister, Dora's like, I flayed myself, because she's basically trying to tell her older sister to go screw herself, which seems totally out of character when it comes to this woman. Oh, she's become young now and she's a queen, but now in a matter of just no time flat, now she's a total bitch. It doesn't make any sense. And the older sister, she decides to take her sister's word, and Emma just hires some guy to flay her, and she's just walking around the town with her skin cut off. And that's how that story basically ends. Oh no, you do get a little bit at the end when Dora becomes old again. But you're like, okay, did you become old again because she uh, uh, essentially screwed her sister over? Is that why? Or is it because there's a time limit? I don't know. None of that's ever explained. And why couldn't she just, I don't know, find the same witch who happens to be in the woods. Why couldn't she find the same witch and say, hey, can you make my sister younger? And then maybe it would be like, the twist would be, you made your sister younger, but then at the cost of your life, or you become old again or something. No, none of that's ever really discussed in that way. You don't really get that. It's just, oh, she's younger now, and she's in relations with the king, and she's gonna be the queen, and now she doesn't want anything to do with her sister and is acting way out of character, and then now she's old again. I don't really understand what was even going on there. The third story is called The Flea, and this is another king, the king of High Hills. He becomes fascinated by a flea, and he decides to have this flea as a pet. Why he does this is never really clarified. Uh, is he lonely? Is he obsessed with like death or disease, or is he into insects? Like, none of this is ever explained. He just randomly is just like, oh, I like fleas now, and he decides to keep a flea, and then decides to do all this stuff with the flea, and then for whatever reason the flea grows to gigantic size. None of that's ever explained. None of that's ever detailed. It's just, now it's a giant flea, and then the flea dies, and then he decides to skin the flea, which I'm like, wait a second, he really liked the flea, and he was friends with the flea, and in a lot of ways he liked the flea more than his own daughter, but then he skins the flea. What, isn't that kind of isn't that kind of lame? Oh, I love his flea, but I'm gonna skin it instead of giving it like a proper burial or anything. I'm gonna skin this flea because I'm gonna use it as a test, so my daughter can just stay with me perpetually, because no one's ever gonna guess that this hide is the hide of a flea. But then apparently it's some cave ogre or cave troll who goes up there, flea, and then he takes the girl, takes his daughter. His daughter then is there trapped with the cave with the ogre. And other than a scene where he takes her to bed, it doesn't really show the ogre treating her that badly. So I think the script did a pretty bad job making you think that the ogre is like this monster when it comes to him having the girl. Like, it just said, oh, he took her to bed a little forcefully, but other than that, that's it. It's not like you see him like hitting her or abusing her in any way. So I think that was definitely something that should have been thrown in there to flesh out the story more. But of course, they don't do that because we're just going to copy the story. We're going to copy the fairy tale word for word, so we're not going to go there. And so the girl sees some other girl cross from the way on the cliff one day, asks her for help. The girl's like, I can't help you, but my sons can. So just wait till tomorrow. I'll bring my sons. Tomorrow happens. She brings her sons. The sons are acrobats, like circus performers, so they can like walk on high rise is not the right word, but can walk on a tightrope over high buildings or high precipices. And so one of the sons goes after the girl, puts him on his shoulders, walking across the rope. The ogre goes in and is swinging on, is grabbing the rope and climbing towards them. They cut the rope in time before the ogre takes them all down. And they think that they've escaped safely, but the ogre somehow survived his fall, because the ogre falls into a cliff. Like, he literally falls like multiple stories, and then he shows up later and just beats everyone crap out of half the family of these acrobats and performers, and he winds up killing them all. The only survivor is the daughter of the king, who then tricks the ogre, slits his throat, goes back to the kingdom with the ogre's decapitated head, and essentially says, "Here you go, Dad. Here's the man that you asked me to marry." And the father's like, "Can you forgive me?" And then the daughter cries, and you're like, "Okay, all right." That was it, really? Okay. And the end of the film is weird because it's trying to tie everything together, but it just comes across as kind of just very forced and awkward, because now it's just this random ceremony, I guess, to coronate the this particular king's daughter as the new queen. Because, but I thought it was a completely different kingdom. So now it's all the same kingdom. If it's all the same kingdom, why are there three different kings? That doesn't make any sense. And so she's there to be coronated, I guess, and there's the albino prince who's there, and the other king, and his chosen queen Dora. So I guess, okay, that's not gonna be the case. So there's not three different kings. But I just don't understand the whole queen thing. Is it because her father was sick and he can't be king anymore, so now she's queen? Like, that is not really that's not explained properly. I was just like, because I don't think you would have a ceremony that's this lavish and make a big deal out of this if it's just like, hey, she's a princess. So it's just like, I don't really get that. And then of course it ends with Dora turning old and then running off. And then you don't even know what happens. Like, does she become fully old and then the other guy, the king, finds out about it and kills her? Or does she leave, go back to the forest? And does she go back and be with her sister, or wants to be with her sister but then finds her dead? None of that is ever at any point explained. So there's a lot of stuff that just is left up in the air, don't really know what's going on, and it just makes for a very unsatisfying watch. Now, all of that being said, I think some of the American actors here, the Hollywood performers, they do some decent work. Like Salma Hayek, I thought did a pretty honorable job as the queen of Long Trellis. She definitely showcased the right amount of emotion when she needed to, especially when she was distraught over not being able to conceive. And she was ruthless when she needed to be, and she really sold the scene when she ate the heart. That could have been something that could have been very ridiculous, but she sold it and made it come across as a genuinely unsettling and effective scene. Vincent Cassel, on the other hand, as the King of Strongcliff, the horn dog, his performance was very hit and miss. Like the first main scene that he had that had a lot of dialogue, his line delivery was atrocious. It was really bad. And that's what I'm talking about in terms of like maybe some lost in translation with the director, because I think if the director was able to communicate with his actors better, he would have been like, hey, that's not going to cut it, let's do another take. But instead he was just like, okay, I guess that's fine. But that take was terrible. I think maybe he was supposed to be drunk, his character, but it didn't even come across like his character was drunk. It just came across like a really bad acting. The rest of the performance was fine, but that first scene was brutal. Toby Jones, I thought he was terrific. Like, he was the best, honestly, other than Salma Hayek, the best performer in this as the King of High Hills. Especially the scene when he reacts to his daughter's return. Like, that's some really good acting. I think it's honestly some of his best acting as an actor. And he really sold the relationship that he had, or the friendship that he had with this flea. John C. Reilly is the king of Long Trellis. Totally miscast. Like, you do not buy it at all. Like, you think that you're watching a skit. You really do. You don't think that you're watching a professional feature film is supposed to be serious. You think you're watching a parody because of John C. Reilly's appearance as the king and his acting in that scene. Shirley Henderson as Emma and Haley Carmichael as Dora. They were okay, but once again, you had this issue of younger actresses wearing old age makeup, and it's obvious. And I get why they did that, but they had a different actress who played the young Dora anyway. So why couldn't it just be two older actresses? Why did it have to be younger actresses in old age makeup? The makeup's not bad, but it's still obviously younger actresses in old age makeup, similar to what happened in uh X. So I just don't understand why they went that route. It was distracting. And the acting wasn't really the best, and it sounded like they were young people in old age makeup. And then so I'm like, did they get cursed? And is that why they're old? Are they witches? Did they become old because of their magic? Nope. It's another thing that's not explained or clarified when it comes to this movie. So the casting made no sense. And the only other people I could think of is like, I don't know, Bebe Cave is Violet, the Princess of High Hills. She was fine. She was decent enough. You also had, Christian Lees as Elias and Jonah Lees as Jonah. Okay, so it's not Joseph, it's Jonah. Regardless, does it really matter? This the twin brothers, and of course, it's definitely identical twins. And those performances were not too bad at all. Trying to think about who played it's Guillaume Delaunay as the ogre, who reminded me a lot of one of those mutants from Hills Have Eyes, or the actor who played Jason in the Friday the 13th remake, Derek Mears. He's definitely an intimidating presence. He's definitely a big guy, so I'll definitely give the performer that. But the cast is fine, but it doesn't save the weaker script, and neither does the visuals by the cinematographer or the editing by Marco Spolenti. The music by Alexandre Desplat is pretty flat, in all honesty. Like it just sounded like typical cliched music for a fantasy film or just mood music, and not really much else other than that. And the only other thing I want to mention is that it's got some decent practical effects at times. The sea monster, there's a good chunk of it that's done practically. They did some stuff with some After Effects and some filtering later, but it's definitely a practical effect when it comes to the battle between the sea monster and the king. And it's definitely a practical effect after the sea monster is dead and washed up on the shore. The heart scene when Salma Hayek's character eats the heart, all done practically. The flea, a large amount of scenes with the flea, especially the larger flea, is all done practically. It's not CGI. There's a couple shots that are CGI, but most of them are all practically done. And so is the creature that Salma Hayek turned into, that's trying to go after Jonah in the cave. There was a good amount of that was done practically as well. So I'll give the film credit for that too. It has some nice looking practical effects. But I mean, it's overlong, it's tedious, it's slow. The way that things are set up when it comes to the anthology structure, it becomes hard to follow and hard to get into because it doesn't finish the story. It just starts another story or goes back to another one. And it's not a terrible tale, but it's not a terrific tale either. And I've seen much better anthologies. I've seen much better adaptations of fairy tales. Like this is not Jim Henson's The Storyteller by any means. But anyway, that's just my thoughts on Tale of Tales. And until next time, I'll see you later. See ya.